The government's badly underestimated the Russian threat and the response it required. It's still playing catch-up. The government's taken its eye off the ball. Arguably, it wasn't even on the pitch. After this government's been in power for 10 years, how does the Prime Minister explain that?
Mr. Speaker, I think the right honourable gentleman's questions are absolutely absurd. There is no country in the Western world that is more vigilant in protecting the interests of this country or the international community from Russian interference. And in fact, we are going further now, introducing new legislation to protect critical national infrastructure and to protect our intellectual property. And I think he will find, if he goes to any international body or any gathering around the world, that is the UK that leads the world in caution about Russian interference. And I must say, I don't wish to contradict the right honourable gentleman, but he sat on his hands, he said nothing. The leader of the opposition parroted the line of the Kremlin that the UK should supply. I didn't hear him criticise the then leader of the opposition. If he criticised the then leader of the opposition, then now is the time for him to set the record straight.
Mr. Speaker, I was absolutely clear in condemning what happened in Salisbury, not least because I was involved in bringing proceedings against Russia on behalf of the Litvinenko family. That is why I was so strong about it. And Mr. Speaker, I spent 5 years as Director of Public Prosecutions working on live operations with the security and intelligence services, so I'm not going to take lectures from the Prime Minister about national security. The Prime Minister says he's going to bring forward...
I think somebody wants to go for a cup of tea. We don't want an early bath. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says he will bring forward new legislation. I want to make it clear to the Prime Minister we will support that legislation and work with the government. It's not before time. 18 months ago, the Prime Minister says the government's vigilant. 18 months ago, the Home Secretary said we don't have all the powers yet to tackle the Russian threat. And he said the Official Secrets Act are completely out of date. Other legislation has been passed in that 18-month period. This is about national security. Why has the government delayed so long in bringing forward this legislation?
Mr. Speaker, this government is bringing forward legislation, not only a new Espionage Act, not only new laws to protect against theft of our intellectual property, but also a Magnitsky Act directly to counter individuals in Russia or elsewhere who transgress human rights. And there's been no doubt what this is really all about, Mr. Speaker. This is about pressure from the Islingtonian Remainers who have seized on this report to try to give the impression that Russian interference was somehow responsible for Brexit, Mr. Speaker. That's what this is all about. The people of this country didn't vote to leave the EU because of pressure from Russia or Russian interference. They voted because they wanted to take back control of our money, of our trade policy, of our laws. And the simple fact is that after campaigning for Remain, after wanting to overturn the people's referendum day in, day out, all the period when he was sitting on the Labour front bench, he simply can't bring himself to accept that.
Can I just gently say to the Prime Minister, as I did last time, he may have to go to Specsavers. The chair is this way, not that way. If you can address me, it would be a lot better. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I see the Prime Minister's already on his pre-prepared lines. This is a serious question of national security. The Prime Minister sat on this report for 10 months and failed to plug a gap in our law on national security for a year and a half. Mr. Speaker, one of the starkest conclusions in the report is that the UK is clearly a target for Russian disinformation campaigns. The report also highlights that this is being met with a fragmented response across Whitehall and across the government. The report refers to this as a hot potato, with no one organisation recognising itself as having the overall lead. That's a serious gap in our defences. This is not about powers, it's about responsibility, Prime Minister. So how is the Prime Minister going to address that gap and make sure the UK meets this threat with the joined-up, robust response it deserves?
Mr. Speaker, there is no other government in the world that takes some more robust steps to protect our democracy, to protect our critical national infrastructure, and to protect our intellectual property, as I have said, from interference by Russia or by anyone else. And frankly, I think that everybody understands that these criticisms are motivated by a desire to undermine the referendum on the European Union, the membership of the European Union that took place in 2016, the result of which he simply cannot bring himself to accept.
A serious gap in our Official Secrets Act, laying bare for 18 months, and that's all the Prime Minister has to say about it. One way the government can seek to clamp down on Russian influence is to prevent the spread of Kremlin-backed disinformation. Obviously, social media companies have a big role to play, but the report also highlights serious distortions in the coverage provided by Russian state-owned international broadcasters such as Russia Today. The High Court has ruled that Russia Today broadcasts pose actual and potential harm. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that it's time to look again at the licensing for Russia Today to operate in the UK?
Mr. Speaker, I think this would come more credibly from the Leader of the Opposition had he called out the former Leader of the Opposition when he took money for appearing on Russia Today. I mean, Mr. Speaker, he protested neither against the former Leader of the Opposition's stance on Salisbury, nor against his willingness to take money from Russia Today. He flip-flops from day to day, Mr. Speaker. One day he's in favour of staying in the EU. The next day he's willing to accept Brexit. Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition has more flip-flops than Bournemouth Beach.
Flip-flops. Alexander Stafford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the party opposite bravely abstained on a vote that attempted to tie us into the EU indefinitely, further highlighting the increasing detachment of Labour from the old heartlands like Rother Valley. Can my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, confirm that we on this side of the House remain fully committed to delivering our promises to the British people and to restoring our full economic independence on the 1st of January, so the people of Thurcroft, Maltby, Diddington and across Rother Valley get the Brexit bonanza and level up that we so deserve?
Mr. Speaker, I certainly can give my honourable friend that assurance. That's what the people voted for, and that's what we will deliver.
Bring Keir Starmer back for one more question. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, pre-prepared gags on flip-flops. This is the former columnist who wrote 2 versions of every article ever published. Mr. Speaker, in case the Prime Minister hasn't noticed, the Labour Party is under new management. And no front bencher of this party has appeared on Russia Today since I've been leading this party. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Prime Minister about the abolition of the Uyghur Muslims in China. We've all seen the footage of the Uyghurs being herded onto trains and heard the heartbreaking stories of forced sterilisation, murder and imprisonment. We support the Foreign Secretary, the Prime Minister and the Government in their strong and clear condemnation of China for this in recent weeks. What further steps will the Prime Minister take, and in particular will he consider targeted sanctions against those responsible, and will he lead a concerted diplomatic action with our international partners to make clear that this simply cannot be allowed to stand in the 21st century?
Mr. Speaker, that's why the Foreign Secretary only this week condemned the treatment of the Uyghurs, and that's why this government, for the first time, has brought in targeted sanctions against those who abuse human rights in the form of the Magnitsky Act. And I'm delighted he now supports the government. But last week, of course, he didn't support the government, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad he's with us this week. I don't know how many more questions he's got, Mr. Speaker, since you allow him to come back and ask throughout this session. We've been getting on consistently with delivering on our agenda. A year ago, Mr. Speaker, this was a Leader of the Opposition who was supporting an anti-Semitism condoning Labour, a government that wanted to repeal Brexit. I represent a government that was getting on with delivering on the people's priorities. 40 new hospitals, Mr. Speaker, 20,000 more police, 50,000 more nurses, and by the way, we've already recruited 12,000 more nurses and 6,000 more doctors and 4,000 more police. We are delivering on the people's priorities. We are the people's government, and by the way, we're the government that supports the workers of this country as well, with the biggest ever increase in the living wage.
We're heading up to Scotland to visit the SNP leader, Ian Blackford. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Tory party held a political cabinet with the Prime Minister in a panic about the majority and increasing support for Scottish independence. Apparently, Mr. Speaker, their great strategy amounts to more UK cabinet ministers coming to Scotland. Can I tell the Prime Minister, the more Scotland sees of this UK government, the more convinced they are the need for Scotland's independence. A far better plan for the Tories would be to listen to the will of the Scottish people. So, before his visit tomorrow, will the Prime Minister call a halt to his government's full frontal attack on devolution?
Mr. Speaker, I really don't know what the right honourable gentleman is talking about. So the only bill I can think of that's before the House or will be coming before the House and that I know enjoys cross-party support is the UK internal market bill. And although that is a massively devolutionary bill, Mr. Speaker, which gives huge powers straight back from Brussels to Scotland, its principal purpose is to protect jobs and protect growth throughout the entire United Kingdom, to stop pointless barriers of trade between all four parts of our country, and anybody sensible, Mr. Speaker, would support it.
Yeah. Ian Blackford.
Anybody sensible, Mr. Speaker, would realise from that answer that the Prime Minister simply does not get Scotland. In 2014, the people of Scotland were promised devolution max, near federalism, the most powerful devolved parliament in the world. Instead, we got a Tory trade bill that threatens our NHS, an immigration bill that will devastate our economy, a power grab that will dismantle devolution, Scotland's powers grabbed by Westminster, workers' rights attacked, the rate clause in the bedroom tax, our NHS up for sale, the overwhelming majority in Scotland's parliaments, its MPs and its people oppose all these measures. How can the Prime Minister claim that this is a union of equal partners when these damaging policies will all be imposed upon Scotland against its will?
Minister.
I mean, I really hesitate to accuse the right honourable gentleman of failing to listen to my last answer, but it's very clear that the UK internal market bill is massively devolutionary, Mr. Speaker, but that is not its. That is 70 powers passed from Brussels to Scotland. I think it's quite incredible. Of course, its purpose is very sensible, which is to protect jobs and growth throughout the entire UK. But just on a political level, it seems bizarre to me that the Scottish Nationalist Party actually want to reverse that process, hand those powers back to unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats in Brussels. Is that really the policy? I don't think it's sensible.
Tom Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Health Secretary's call for a review into the reporting of coronavirus deaths. I raised this point recently with a national statistician at a PAC Select Committee evidence session, and he said that the numbers themselves would not change the policy, but would my right honourable friend agree that true numbers will help improve confidence in the policy? And as the Royal College of Pathologists have pointed out, failing to determine the difference between dying of and with COVID-19 is key to understanding getting better information and key to understanding this disease.